Hi, this is Paul, and on Mondays I usually run through a bunch of things that I found last week, over the weekend. On the Jordan Peterson front, there was a piece in Politico, um, Political magazine, which I thought was a fairly fair representation of Peterson. Someone actually in my church picked this up and sent it to me, and I thought that was interesting because part of this whole journey is gauging what normal regular people see. And so it's not only interesting what people find, but who finds it and what they're reading and what they're thinking. Also, there was a piece in the Catholic Register that was also quite in favor of Peterson. I had my conversation with Peterson last week, and he made a comment about getting some rough treatment from the church, and I think that's true. It's uneven because there are also a fair number of people in church that are excited about what's going on with him, and this was a rather pro Peterson article. Outspoken Prof is church's ally, and it's a fairly brief piece, but quite positive towards him. Alan Jacobs, whose book I'm reading right now, How to Think, wrote a very interesting piece on his sad compatibilism, where he mentions Jordan Peterson, and then he links also to this much longer piece by, again, Alistair Roberts, who had written quite a significant piece last week, and he's obviously following Peterson closely. And again, this was a fairly long and meaty engagement with Peterson, and I think Peterson tweeted this, so that was certainly well worth taking a look at. Also this morning, Peterson tweeted a piece on his reading of the Bible, which I thought was quite even-handed and fairly nuanced, which was also a pretty good piece, pretty good conversation. Then of course there was this piece in the New York Times, which was funny because I have a brother-in-law who is from Manitoba. And so I sent it to him, and he didn't like it at all. And then the next day or so, Peterson tweeted it, and he didn't like it at all. And I thought, yeah, that's I'm not at all surprised. I'm not at all surprised. So, but it's so funny because sometimes when I listen to Peterson, I think about my brother-in-law, and I think about we have so many layers, and we have these personalities and cultures, and I'm from New Jersey. I'm from the East, and there's sometimes that my East Coast Patterson nature comes out. But I've got, my parents grew up in different places, and so elements of those come through. We're such complex, interwoven, complicated creatures in terms of culture and temperament and experiences and theological confessions, philosophical positions. So that was kind of an interesting piece. This was something that someone had sent to me. Will Jordan Peterson lead people to God or seduce them with a substitute? And I'd said, well, do you think Jordan Peterson is he pot to heroin Jesus, or is he just methadone? And people are going to get stuck in his Christianity light, or alt Christianity light, or some such thing. And this of course, as I commented with Peterson, this is in some sense the central fascination I have with what's going on, is how is he going to intersect with the large religious conversations, and why are people coming to Peterson? Last night I went to a meetup in Berkeley of a group of people who got together via Reddit. They didn't have an official meetup like on meetup.com like I'm using for mine, but just a fascinating conversation. I love figuring out how Peterson is changing their lives, how he's changing their lives religiously to a certain degree, how he's changing their lives politically, and where they're going with it, how that's working for them. The interesting relationship between Peterson's work and the Orthodox, the Orthodox community of churches, Greek Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, Antioch, and of course Jonathan Pajot is at the center of this. and doing some thinking about that. I'll get into that a little bit later with the Ron Dart conversation. But I think when you're looking at the mythological and the symbolism, it's always fun going to these meetups because I like to hear what people have to say and what they catch, because so often, I think Peterson he's taught me a ton about this. So often it's what gets caught in our filters. We know what our filters are doing by what's getting caught in them. And so, obviously people are listening to hours and hours and hours of Peterson videos, but what certain things catch in their filters that get their attention? I pay very close attention to those things because that can tell me what their filters are, and that'll give me a little better understanding of kind of what's happening in the zeitgeist, in the larger conversations with our culture. And one of the things that got mentioned is Jonathan Pageau's statement about, he doesn't read any Jung, he just reads church fathers. And so, okay, what's the relationship between Jung and the church fathers? And this is getting into my, one of the hypotheses that I'm kind of quietly working in my head, which is the implicit language of symbolism. And this very much gets into the question of, okay, so Peterson via Jung see these archetypes, these structural things built into us, especially now with Peterson with respect to evolution. These structural things built into us through evolution. We're afraid of spiders and snakes, and so are chimps, and so there's all this stuff, and this, in a sense, kind of like Jonathan Haidt's project. This builds in us. Jonathan Haidt likes to use moral taste buds. With Jordan Peterson, we're getting more into mythology and structures, and so this builds into us this, in a sense, symbolic language that perhaps is a pre-language that is trans-cultural to a great degree, that cuts across the language barriers. It's, in a sense, then, biblically speaking, or mythologically, biblically speaking, it's pre-Tower of Babel. And so, Jonathan is working very much in the symbolic world. That's been his focus. And Peterson, in a sense, is trying to see through the Bible to these symbolic roots. And whereas biblical scholars for 100 years have been working what's called source criticism, where they look at, the Yahwists, the priestly, the Deuteronomists. They look at all of these pre-canonical layers to try and find out, well, what's the source of the Bible? Where's this coming from? Now, again, that project is rooted in post-Enlightenment thinking that looks to validate truth in a historic/materialist layer. Peterson is, in a sense, trying to mine the Bible and not necessarily get at the documentary sources of the text, but he's trying to get at the evolutionary sources of the text. And that's, in a sense, where, Jung obviously had a similar project, but in a sense, the symbolic exegetical layer that Jonathan Pageau is mining is in that sense much closer to Peterson's. So then it's been very, very interesting to me how many people who are, so they were at an atheist position and now they're looking back into Christianity, and they're probably partly due to Jonathan Pageau, but partly due to Peterson. But I think because of this attempting to get at this pre-language symbolic framework that carries meaning, a lot of interest in the Orthodox Church. Again, large O, Orthodox family of churches. I've talked a little bit with Jonathan Pageau about how these fragmented Orthodox churches, when they come to America, in a sense, you get this hybrid of there's a strange Orthodox ecumenism that's developing, which in some ways is related to this Protestant market-based ecumenism, which is really evangelicalism, because that's, I think, the best explanation for what evangelicalism is. And if you read a scholar such as Mark Knoll, he wrote a very interesting piece in Biologos a number of years ago. He talked about how, especially when churches moved out of the original 13 colonies into the frontier states, very early, pushing past the Appalachians and then into the Louisiana Purchase and then over the Mississippi into the West, they left those European churches behind. And so these churches needed to find a new language by which to connect each other. They're past the confessional fights of the Europe that they left. And so that's when you get all this language about Bible-believing church. And the text itself in American church history then takes on the role that a confession had made in the historic European confessional Protestant churches. And so when the large O Orthodox churches move into the United States and they find themselves in a sea of mainline and all these Protestants, and in the 20th century, this ever-growing, larger Catholic presence, but the Catholic Church in America also is undergoing these weird complexes where the stuff of Europe gets filtered out, and so this, I don't want to call it an evangelicalization, it's really an Americanization of churches that happens to the Protestant confessional churches, to the Roman Catholic Church, and is now, because the Orthodox Church is in some ways so late in coming, especially so late in coming out west, they too are experiencing this strange working of, in some ways we're seeing the rise of the American Orthodox Church. I was having a conversation with some friends. One of my friends is a good friend of an Orthodox priest that is in the area, and they had an open forum, and they were talking about evangelization of unchurched people, and the priest said, well, we're hardly ready to evangelize. We haven't built our churches, and we haven't set up our monasteries, and we can't really do that until we do those things. And again, this presented such a different focus from evangelicalism. In the group I met with last night, one person had just recently been baptized just like that, and another two are in the process of either having a part of or seeking Orthodox catechesis, which is going to be a long path, which is, now this gets into some interesting Christian Reformed Church history, but it's this Americanization of the church. Now Peterson is in this somehow, and I'm trying to figure out where this all fits together, and I think a lot of it has to do, again, with this. He's doing source criticism of the text, but it's not documentary source criticism. He's working this symbolism as language layer of the text, and he's connecting that with evolutionary roots and using evolutionary psychology and some of these other things to come at it from above. And again, this is the larger attempt by Peterson to try to put the world back together. Now, part of what happens when Roman Catholics, Orthodox, evangelicals of various stripes take a look at Peterson, they have a filter. And as when I get into Ron Dart, or some of Ron Dart's videos, Dart notes that people come at Peterson with their own objections and say, well, here's my theological confessional filter. You fail to hit that filter, therefore the filter blocks out Peterson. Another comes at Peterson from perhaps their literalistic, evangelical, Bible-believing filter and say, nope, Darwinism, you're not going to get past my filter. I'm going to reject you. And so then when pieces get written, how should Christians regard Jordan Peterson? Usually the different groups put up their filters. Now, those who really pertain to the church of liberal, political liberal, ideological orthodoxy, when Jordan Peterson refuses to use pronouns, or when Jordan Peterson denounces things like white privilege or gender equality, gender identity, well, that's their filter. So then they block him there. And as Ron Dart, again, I've mentioned him a few times, I should pull him up. Some of the videos that I'm most enjoying that don't seem to be watched by a lot of people are these Ron Dart commentaries that are on Brad Jersik's YouTube channel. And Ron Dart is not sure what he's a professor of, but he's a Canadian professor, and he has some of these kind of slow, unlike loud and boisterous me, impulsive, he's just kind of walking through Jordan Peterson and all the various issues, and he just does it so well. And in this one, he's talking about how Jordan Peterson treats the Bible. And again, the whole video is worth listening to, but just here at the conclusion, he puts together some things that I hadn't really thought of.
And so people like Gregory of Nyssa, and there's many others, will look at the whole mythic element of the Exodus, and this is the second book, obviously, of the Hebrew canon, of the X, out of Hodos, the way. So what is the way out of our internal bondage, psychologically and spiritually, into the promise in which we recover our image and likeness? Well, you can see that this spiritual reading of the text, when a person goes beyond simply the literal, the moral, the typological, the anagogical.
He's going through there in the Middle Ages. Medieval church fathers read the text in 4 layers, and that's kind of how they understood the text. Now, what happens in the Protestant Reformation, in this whole long cultural philosophical movement that takes place in Europe, and then the turn away from the text that I've talked about in some of my previous videos, the Protestant reformers want to, in a sense, on Protestant reading, you'll often just kind of leave the text with 2 levels: the literal level, and then what is often called the typological level. And that's as close as, in traditions like my own, that's as close as people will get to this symbolic layer that Jonathan Pozos is working, especially with respect to the church fathers. And so what Ron Dart is doing here is he's mapping out the layers, and he's basically saying, people are coming at Jordan Peterson and they're knocking him because he's not bowing to any particular layer, and that's really not fair, because that's not Peterson's project. If you want to engage with Peterson, look at his project, evaluate him within the project. Now, if you want to say, well, Peterson doesn't take the Bible literally, then I'm not going to listen to him. Well, fine, don't listen to him. If you want to say, well, Peterson doesn't bow his knee at the altar of social justice warriorism, I'm not going to listen to him. Well, then fine, don't listen to him. Now what Peterson will say is, yeah, if you keep playing this game, at some point, you who are in the political high ground, you might decide you want to imprison me or kill me because I'm not bowing my knee to your temple. Well, then let's face a few facts here about what the larger political game is. And so Ron Dart is running through some of those layers, and this is where he goes to.
Into the anthropological, mystical, has a lot of affinities with the mythical. And so when Peterson is turning to the mythical, there's an amazing portal between the mythical and the mystical. And I think if people follow where Peterson is going in terms of his deeper mythical read of the text, or the existential read, or the psychological read, because there's a close connection between the psyche and the pneuma, in terms of self-understanding. And so this is where probably Peterson, more than any other person at the present time, is drawing people into a deeper read of the text, which then can open, if properly understood, to the mystical or the spiritual reading of the text itself. And with the great interest in today in the contemplative, the mystical, the spiritual theology, it's not much of a step to go from the mythical to the mystical, or to the spiritual reading of the text. And anyone who reads any of the mothers and fathers of the church, and those continued that 6-fold understanding of how you read the text, will see Peterson takes them beyond the literal, the historical, without denying it. It's not a matter of one or the other of six. It's a bit like a theological clown keeping many balls in the air. And these different exegetical means, some people juxtapose in the early church Antioch and Alexandria, which is quite unfair because Alexandria, from Origen onward, I mean, the first great Christian university was in Alexandria, and Origen's set in place, drawing from a much older tradition, these layered levels of reading the text. And you look at his approach. And so it's a very easy step to move from Jordan Peterson's mythical, existential, psychological, right into Origen and Alexandria, and then you just follow that whole Alexandrian tradition up through Evagrius Ponticus, Gregory of Nyssa, any of these. You get the same thing in Western exegetes as well. So I think the key thing to note, and I'll conclude here, is that if one is going to get focused on Peterson's approach to the Bible, and obviously he could be tracked in many other ways, but if many people come from a Christian background are obviously quite interested in Peterson, is not to dismiss him as being Pelagian or because he's interested in Jung as Gnostic. It's certainly not a literalist. Certainly respect for evolution and trying to understand how the Bible, and particularly its great mythic structures, reflect and actually can co-inhere with an evolutionary understanding of the Bible. So it doesn't have to be either or. Theology, Bible, or science. In fact, he's very interested in synthesizing. And his particular mythical approach to the text, anyone who's followed the multiple lectures he's given in Toronto, and then his big early magnum opus on maps of meaning, and then 12 rules for life, can see how he again uses the Bible. And then if you follow Peterson further, it's a very easy pathway to take from a mythical psychological read of the text into a mystical spiritual reading of the text. It's just a few more steps down the road. It'll be interesting to see where Peterson goes with that. So I'll conclude with that then. So Jordan Peterson and the Bible, trying to get a good understanding. What is myth? Myth is not separate from history. Myth just deepens our understanding of history. And anyone who can reflect even on their own journey why they enjoy fairy stories or why Lord of the Rings is popular, or Harry Potter or Star Wars, these are great myths. And how the Bible, in many ways, the great themes of the Bible can easily be seen in those great mythic works. We've all grown up on fairy stories, which are secular myths, because myths tend to have a much more deeper sacred context. And so, but there is this real close affinity again between myth and fairy tale. But it isn't too far a journey in many ways from myth, fairy tale to spiritual reading of the Bible. And if people can see, he can see where in fact the pathway Peterson is on, there can be actually some excellent work done on myth and mysticism as exegetical reads or psychological reads and spiritual reading of the text. So for those who are interested in Peterson and the Bible, be careful of not reducing him to simplistic approaches. He's extremely nimble, and at this point he's extremely open. And maybe just one point, underneath all the what he does is the notion of the eternal Logos, ever living, ever breathing. So the myth points the way to the living Logos, the transformative Logos, and this is important. Where in fact his engagement with Friedrich Nietzsche and Martin Heidegger is very important. The living Logos of pre-Socratic thought. So it's not a matter of just paradigms and images and myths. It's what do they mean as people are open to the engaging living Logos, or what in the creeds would be called, believe in the Holy Spirit, the Lord, the giver of life. So Logos and Pneuma is very important in all this. So there's this in Peterson, constant this notion that history is open. And it's open, everything hinges on human choice. And so myth and history in that sense are deeply connected. For Peterson, just as spiritual reading a text is deeply connected to history itself.
And boy, there's a ton there. There's a ton there. Can't go into all of that. I don't want this to be a long treatment of, let's say, this video, but that'll give you a taste into how lucid and perceptive and balanced and fair Ron Dart is in kind of figuring out Peterson. Now, in that last section, I might have some conversation with him, but I think if you watch this series, this is the third of the series that this individual is putting up of Ron Dart's musing on Peterson. This is some of the best, most succinct, clearest, most balanced analysis of Peterson that I've found on YouTube. So it's well worth checking out, and that's on Brad Jersik's channel, and I'll put a link into the notes. And then just this, the integral life people. Someone sent me these links and had a couple of videos. Overall, I thought there were some good takeaways from this. I think just like when I talked about with filters, the integral life people have their filter. Everyone has a filter. In a sense, as they deal with Peterson, you begin to see the filter most clearly that they have, and they've got a fairly rigid view of warrior, traditional, modern, postmodern, and then their system, which is integral life, is against the next evolution, and that's in a sense always the shtick, and I don't want to deal with that unfairly, but if there's, and I want to be careful with this because I think Christianity is finally a progressivistic religion. But if your basic orientation is a progressivism, then you almost can't but identify yourself as with the latest evolution. And once you identify yourself as the latest evolution, well, then it's in a sense the game over. And so. And this is the problem where, again, if we get back into, say, the what I call the iron box of secularism, part of how God functions in the life of someone who is a significant theist, let's say, and maybe even for someone whose theism is a little thinner. Let's say, at least if you have a really good functioning idea of God, that you always keep the, I want to say archetypal, but that's not quite the right word. You always keep the top of the hierarchies just outside of reach of humanity. And now the integral life people, they say, well, it's probably going to evolve beyond us. Yeah, but you're the most evolved person you know. And if we begin the conversation that way, and on one hand, we all think we're all the most evolved person or the most balanced person, or, my favorite people are some of the people who know they're not the most balanced people. But it's part of what's handy about there being a God is it can limit your idolatries. Because what idolatry is that you take anything within the system and make that an ultimate. Well, once the ultimate is within your system, not above it, the person who controls the idol then becomes the ultimate. And this is, I think, part of the reason why people are so drawn to impersonal frameworks for the universe. And you see this, let's say, in Star Wars, the Force. The Force is impersonal. Or pantheism. Pantheism is impersonal. The reason we really like impersonal frameworks is because we as personal beings can exert will upon the impersonal. And when that happens, we then become the God. And this is exactly why, if you look at my sermon yesterday, we see tools. We love to see tools. And why in Christianity, and I think Judaism, which is why you're not to make an image of the God, because once you make that image of the God, even mentally, and it's really hard, how are you going to worship this God that you really can't make an image of? And definitely don't make an image in concrete things, because once you make an image of that God, you can now manipulate this God, and you yourself become God. And this is the great trap that we fall into, because once I am God, I suddenly have a significantly lesser God than I need, because most of my problems are not necessarily out there with social justice warriors or heretics or people of other religions or people of no religion. Most of my real problems are right here in me. And once I make myself the God, game's up. There's no escaping my problems. So there's a little thing at the end of the video. Anyway, this was just kind of some of the stuff I found this weekend. And again, if you want to look for some of the best treatment, or I'd say summary, balanced, clearest, succinct, fair of Peterson, just in terms of analyzing him and describing him, check out some of Ron Dart's videos.